Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sean Resendiz and welcome to my podcast. Recently, I've been interested in the issue of gentrification, which typically occurs when developers come into low-income areas and start building homes and retail stores that are attractive to middle and upper-class people. These renovations often lead to the displacement of lower-income people that lived in these areas previously. However, rather than analyze gentrification from this common lens, I wanted to see what happens when the opposite of gentrification takes place. What occurs when an influx of lower-income people begin moving into a neighborhood and the neighborhood's infrastructure and resources begin deteriorating? How does this impact the cultural makeup of a community and the people that live there? To answer these questions, I decided to interview my one and only friend, my mom. My mom was born and raised in the Bronx, New York, which is one of the 5 main boroughs that comprise New York City. She did most of her growing up between the period of 1960 and 1980, which was when her neighborhood really began declining. Between this period, crime skyrocketed, and some tracts of the Bronx lost as much as 97% of their buildings to fire and abandonment. I want to see how these circumstances would affect her view on gentrification and whether she believed neighborhoods could improve without immense renovation. Let's begin. Okay, so would you first just mind stating your name, date of birth, and birthplace for all our listeners?
Sure. My name is Dolores Resendiz. My date of birth is 12/15/57, and I was born in the Bronx, New York.
Okay, could you just give us a little bit of a background as to what it was like growing up in the Bronx as a child?
So it was really a nice place to grow up. I grew up in a neighborhood that was mostly Irish and Jewish. Multiple members of families and multiple generations of a family lived in apartment buildings. So it was a very close-knit kind of community with a lot of family members close by.
So I know you've mentioned that during the time you lived there, things really began to change in the neighborhood as you grew older. Could you touch on that briefly if you don't mind?
Sure. So when I was about 12 years old, I would say my neighborhood started to change. As I mentioned, it was mostly a lower to middle class neighborhood, almost entirely white, made up of Irish families, families from Irish descent, and Jewish families. When I was the age of 12, some of the landlords started renting out apartments to Section 8 recipients. So those were people who had received public housing vouchers. And what happened was, for the first time since I lived there, we started having people of color coming into the neighborhood, Latino, African American. And some of the people, in fact, a lot of the people who lived in the neighborhood were really frightened by this. It was just a whole new world for them. And what started to happen was people who had lived in the neighborhood started fleeing the neighborhood, and some chose to stay. My family was one of the families that chose to stay.
Why did your family specifically choose to stay, whereas so many others fled?
Yeah, my family, my parents were very liberal. They didn't feel that people were of any lesser value because they were a different race or religion. They also felt like this was their home. They could peacefully coexist, and they felt nobody was going to run them out of their home. In fact, 4 years later, they purchased their very first home, and they purchased it in that neighborhood.
In the very neighborhood that newer people began moving into?
Correct. So a lot of their friends were leaving the neighborhood. My parents had never owned a home, but they loved that neighborhood. They grew up in that neighborhood. They raised their family in that neighborhood. They thought it would all be absolutely fine. And so, when I was around age 16 or 17, they purchased their first home right in that neighborhood.
So it seems to me that because they had lived there for so long, your parents viewed the Bronx or the neighborhood that you lived in as their home, and they just didn't want to leave because of this. And this sort of ties into the whole subject of gentrification. The main argument against gentrification tends to be that it forces people out of homes and neighborhoods that they've lived in for so long. So I guess my first question in regards to this topic is just, what is your general view on gentrification?
So I agree with that statement that it forces people out of homes, either because of their own perceptions about what's going on or because of their ability to afford to stay in those neighborhoods and, live a quality life.
So what it sounds like to me is basically the opposite of gentrification occurred in the Bronx. Lower income people began moving into the neighborhood and people with higher incomes began moving out. Why do you feel like gentrification did not occur in the Bronx?
I think because it became a lesser desirable place to live in people's minds. And I think the change in the neighborhoods happened so quickly that people just weren't prepared for it. So as I said, the neighborhood started changing when I was 12 years old. By the time 5 years later, the neighborhood had completely changed. It had become unsafe. There was a lot of arson. There was a lot of crime, and it all happened so quickly. So I think that it's possible that now, maybe it's happening now, maybe enough time has gone by and people see the value of what the Bronx has to offer as far as convenience and lifestyle and culture. But at that time, I don't believe people could see that. People were just seeing the demise of, a family neighborhood.
Yeah, I was reading a few articles that said the Bronx is New York's next target for gentrification, and this is obviously upsetting a lot of people who live there currently. But back to what we were saying, did you ever experience racial tension or violence as a result of these newer people moving into your community?
Yeah, there was a little bit of both. So there definitely was tension between the different groups. But there also was violence. I mean, buildings started getting burned down. People started having trouble just even moving around the neighborhood. I experienced it myself when I was on a bus coming home and got kicked off the back of a bus. It was totally racially motivated. During that time, I'm talking about the 1970s, there were a lot of race riots happening everywhere in the United States, and we certainly weren't immune to it in the Bronx. And I think people had hard feelings about change being forced upon them. So that caused all kinds of conflict between everybody.
Okay, so back to gentrification specifically, something I've thought a lot about is I feel like it's very hard to improve a community if gentrification does not occur. Because if you want to improve a lower income community, you have to put some investment into the community itself. And whenever you put money into a community, the cost of living inevitably rises. So do you feel gentrification is necessary to uplift a community, or do you think that there's ways to go about it that wouldn't necessarily lead to an increase in the cost of living?
I think there definitely are ways to do it other than to come in, and put in high-priced housing and, high-end retailers. First of all, not every neighborhood needs improvement. There's this cultural misunderstanding between people because somebody lives differently from me. It's less than me. So I think what you really need are representatives from these neighborhoods to have a voice and be able to express their opinions about what they want and to work across the table with people that may be wanting to come in and, do some development there. I think where the problem always comes from is when one group is excluded from the table. And then one group is forcing their ideas and their ways on the other group.
I think my final question is, why did you and your family, or rather you specifically, choose to leave the Bronx? And why did you choose to raise your children in a more suburban, less cultural environment?
So, we always want something better for our kids. And ultimately, we ended up leaving the Bronx because it became very unsafe. As I mentioned, there were buildings burning, there were crimes happening. My parents sold their house at a loss because the neighborhood just wasn't desirable anymore. I chose to raise my family in the suburbs because I have vivid memories of the violence that I personally experienced living in the Bronx. And, as you know, I had a gun pulled on me. I was shot with a pellet gun. I was assaulted. It just became a scary place to live, and I didn't want my children to live in that environment. That being said, having now moved to the suburbs, to me, that's not the real world. And they are missing something very vital that you only get in a city environment where you have lots of different people with different backgrounds. So I wouldn't say that that was the perfect solution, and it was a solution based totally on fear and wanting my children to be safe. But, you get older and you get wiser and you realize, well, it doesn't mean that you have to put your children in harm's way. You just have to be smart about where you choose to live.
One of my main takeaways from our conversation is the role fear plays in all of our lives. So many of the decisions we make on a day-to-day basis are influenced by fear. The reason gentrification often happens is because people are fearful of the cultures that are present in their new environments and demand familiarity rather than uniqueness. People tend to want neighbors and establishments that reflect their backgrounds and can be less tolerant of pre-existing structures that contradict their perceptions of normality. The same goes for scenarios such as the Bronx, where the opposite of gentrification occurred. Fear is what drove so many families away, and fear is what ignited so much of the tension between the groups that decided to stay. Some of these fears, such as the fear for your children's safety, are totally justified, whereas others simply come from misunderstandings or a lack of acceptance. People generally do not like change. They are afraid of it, but it is my belief that without change we cannot grow and progress as a society. I no longer believe neighborhoods need significant renovation or gentrification to improve, but I also don't think they should remain stagnant either. As difficult as it may be, cities need to invest in a neighborhood's people rather than the neighborhood itself, and people need to take responsibility for their neighborhoods if they wish to preserve any element of its culture. People's fears will never truly be eliminated, but they can be reduced by preserving culture and molding it into a normality of everyday life.
I don't know. I'm a little bit of a dreamer myself. I just like to see people able to get along and exist, and I don't know.